All right, welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight for movie Mythbusting. This is a regular series that we have where we look at movies and Virginia's history, and we talk about what's real and what's not. So my name is Haley Finner. I'm excited to welcome you guys. I am with the Museum of History and Culture, but tonight we are Mythbusting Apollo 13, and I'm here to tell y'all I am not the queen of Mythbusting Apollo 13. It is not exactly my wheelhouse. And you might be wondering, well, Haley, why are you guys doing this? And that's because the museum, opening this Saturday, is hosting an exhibition called Apollo, When We Went to the Moon. So this chronicles the timeline of the space race. So we'll look at sort of when the United States and the Soviet Union are competing over accomplishments in space exploration, and it even goes up to the present day. But because we're a history museum, we also want to recognize and highlight the role that Virginia played in the space race with the research that was being done at NASA Langley Research Center in the Hampton Roads area. So we have a whole slate of programs and some really fantastic stuff on display that goes along with the exhibition. So I told you guys I am not the expert in this content, and I will never pretend to be. So we are joined by our wonderful colleagues at the Science Museum of Virginia. So we're joined by Justin Bartle, who is the Assistant Director of Education. And so I will leave you all in his capable hands tonight as we look at what's true and what's not about Apollo 13.
All right, thanks so much, Haley. Get my screen shared here. Yeah, as Haley mentioned, I'm over at the Science Museum. I lead our astronomy programs within the education department and also manage our dome theater. So if you've been to any of our giant screen films or planetarium shows, well, for the last 9 years now, almost, I've been in charge of those. We're also looking forward to our summer here. We've got our own space exhibit, so plenty of space to go around all summer. Should be a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun putting tonight's presentation together as well. I'm a longtime fan of space in general and space exploration in particular. I went to space camp as a kid. I watched this movie when it was brand new, and I got to watch it again to help me get ready for tonight. So I had a pretty good time doing that. I learned some new things about it, and I'm excited to share. So let's dive right in. Just in case anyone else joining us tonight is also not an expert on space exploration, here's a rundown of some of the real history to kind of set the scene here. Apollo 13, as the mission was originally planned, would have been the third crewed lunar landing as part of the Apollo program. You, of course, had Apollo 11. That was the first one, July 1969. Apollo 12 follows just a few months later in November of 1969. And then Apollo 13, well, that would be the next one up. NASA, of course, has its own parlance, its own lexicon, its own vocabulary when it talks about its missions. And during the Apollo program, each type of mission, the missions with specific goals, had a different label assigned to them, a different letter assigned to them. Apollo 11, that first landing was a G mission. Apollo 12 and 13 were going to be H missions. H missions show that we can do more than just simply land on the moon and get the people back. H missions show that we can choose a specific spot to land and then go do some targeted exploration in those areas. There are really cool pictures from Apollo 12 because they landed within walking distance of an older robotic spacecraft. So the astronauts walked over there, examined the spacecraft, saw how it had fared after being exposed to the lunar surface for a number of months, actually took off some pieces of equipment and brought them home. Apollo 13 then was going to head to a region called the Fra Mauro Highlands. This was a region close to a big impact crater, still kind of a mysterious region of the moon. It would later be explored in a little more detail by Apollo 14. I guess I don't have to do any spoiler alerts for tonight, but Apollo 13 didn't go as planned. So they sent the Apollo 14 astronauts to Fra Mauro instead. And Apollo 13 would have stayed on the moon for about 2 days and done a couple of moonwalks during that time. But of course, if you watch the movie or you know a little bit of the history of the mission, things didn't go as NASA had originally planned. A little over 2 days into the 3-day journey to the moon, the command and service module suffers an explosion, crippling the spacecraft. The lunar module was used as a lifeboat. They just did one loop around the moon, came back home successfully, and something they don't mention in the movie, but an interesting spaceflight record that still stands today. The real Apollo 13 astronauts currently hold the record for the greatest distance humans have traveled away from the Earth. It's not by a lot. If memory serves, it's only by a couple hundred miles, but that is the record for the farthest humans have been from home, which is kind of a neat note as well. So that's the real mission, but let's talk about the movie and how it came to be. I think that's a pretty fascinating story as well. It all starts, of course, with Jim Lovell, the real commander of the Apollo 13 astronaut. In 1994, Lovell had just retired from his post-NASA career. And although I've read that the whole crew of Apollo 13 was planning to write a book about their experience, by 1994, Jack Swigert had passed away and Fred Hayes had decided that he didn't want to be involved in the project. So Lovell was preparing to write the book on his own. He coincidentally gets a letter from a journalist named Jeffrey Kluger. Kluger is also going to write a book about Apollo 13. So Lovell says, how about we collaborate? It becomes a joint project. The book still readily available. You might get it under the title of Apollo 13. It was originally published under the title Lost Moon, if you want to dive into a little more detail. Once Kluger and Lovell were linked up, actually wrote a little book pitch and a sample chapter, and that ended up getting passed around in Hollywood as well. And that, of course, is what led us to the movie about a year later, movie released in 1995. Now, the genesis of the movie, kind of an amazing bit of coincidence. It was not the first movie about the mission. Back in 1974, there had been a made-for-TV movie that highly dramatized the events of Apollo 13. It portrayed some of the people involved in such a poor light that Jim Lovell himself wrote a letter to the NASA administrator complaining that the space agency had cooperated with those filmmakers. That was part of his motivation for returning to the story in the early 90s, wanting to tell the real story of Apollo 13 from somebody that was actually there, and set the record straight to some degree. There again, I've got the note about linking up with Kluger. Now, there are more interesting coincidences, but I thought the best way to illustrate those in true Hollywood fashion would be to play a little game. We're going to try and figure out all the people involved in making the movie by connecting them all to Kevin Bacon. So Kevin Bacon, of course, one of the stars of Apollo 13, the movie. He portrays the astronaut Jack Swigert, the command module pilot. So in Apollo 13, Kevin Bacon appears with Ray McKinnon. He's the actor on the left in that image. Ray McKinnon is portraying one of the mission controllers, so the folks that work in Houston. His character is, of course, based on a real person. Ray McKinnon is playing Jerry Bostick. He's one of the flight dynamics officers, planning the trajectories for the spacecraft. Jerry Bostick is actually the father of Michael Bostick, who was a senior vice president at Imagine Entertainment in 1994. He got a hold of the pitch from Lovell and Kluger. He passed it along to his boss, Ron Howard, and Ron Howard actually directed Kevin Bacon in Apollo 13, so it just links back to the beginning. I could have closed the loop a little sooner, I guess, but Michael Bostick, really the key part of this puzzle. He comes across the script, he takes it to his dad, and Jerry Bostick says, well, they've tried this before. The movie didn't go so well. This one has to go well if you're going to make it. Jerry Bostic was really worried that his old colleagues in Mission Control would never let him hear the end of it if this movie did get made and it was not accurate. So Jerry Bostic stayed involved in the project. He's one of the technical advisors that you'll notice if you read the credits all the way through. Several other former mission controllers stayed involved in the project. And in addition to Jim Lovell, the Apollo 15 astronaut Dave Scott helped out, helped train the actors so they would be prepared to accurately portray the astronauts in the movie. So with this team assembled, Apollo 13 became an incredibly accurate space movie. If you want to get a feel for what the Apollo 13 mission was like, what the Apollo program in general was like, Apollo 13, the movie, is a great place to start. So hope you enjoyed it for that reason. Now, that said, there's always going to be some slight missteps, and just the art of filmmaking sometimes requires that you do have to bend the truth just a little bit. So if you're watching or listening carefully, there are a few things that might jump out at you that seem unusual or maybe too strange to be true. I'd highlight a couple of those. One of my biggest complaints about the movie or biggest mistakes that they actually make in the movie is right off the bat, right at the beginning. So I guess it's only up from there. But Apollo 13 opens with a scene dramatizing the tragic Apollo 1 fire, along with voiceover from Walter Cronkite. Now, Walter Cronkite, his voice is kind of telling the story of Apollo 1, its connection to Apollo 11, because we're going to go into a watch party of the Apollo 11 landing after this. Cronkite says that Apollo 11 is 18 months after the Apollo 1 fire. It was in fact 30, so he skipped a year in there. But that was the real broadcast, so that's what he said. The mistake actually comes in what we see in the movie. We're seeing the Apollo 1 astronauts walk across that gantry into the capsule. Then the pad the crew on the pad is sealing up the capsule, closing the hatch. And the story of that hatch gets referenced later on in the movie. Tom Hanks, portraying Jim Lovell, is talking to their son and telling them that was the problem with the fire and that they fixed it. They didn't quite get it right in the movie either. The whole problem was that inner hatch opened in towards the astronauts. And when you get a fire burning in the capsule, as the solid material that's burning gets transformed into vapor, into gases, it raises the pressure inside the capsule, so you can't open that hatch in. But the only hatch we see is coming from the outside towards the astronauts, as we see it in the film. The real hatch from the Apollo 1 capsule is actually on display now. NASA had it in storage for most of the 5 decades after the Apollo 1 fire, but it recently went on display down at Kennedy Space Center. So if you happen to be down there, you can see that bit of history. Now, on into the movie Apollo 13, there are some moments where, again, they're bending the truth just a little bit. Most of these can be forgiven just as ways to further the story as we're watching it in the movie. And of course, if you read the credits all the way through, you also see that standard disclaimer that some characters and events have been fictionalized. So I thought I would challenge you to see if you could identify which scenes have been fictionalized before I reveal them. So I've got a couple of screenshots from Apollo 13 here, a couple of things that may or may not have been invented by the writers and filmmaking team. On the left, we have also very early on in the movie, that's the watch party at Jim Lovell's house for the Apollo 11 moon landing. And then on the right, we've got Gary Sinise as astronaut Ken Mattingly, just got kicked off the Apollo 13 mission, and he's brooding on the Florida coast, ready to watch the launch. So think about those two moments that took place in the movie. Think about whether one of those may have been fictionalized by the filmmakers. I mean, a lot of people were watching Apollo 11 on TV. It was the most watched event on television worldwide. Or maybe Ken Mattingly just needed a moment of solace after being taken off the mission. Well, I'll tell you that in this case, both of those events totally fictionalized. Neither of those happened. For the Apollo astronauts, if they weren't flying, there's a pretty good chance they were still involved in the mission somehow. For all of the Apollo flights, you had the prime crew that actually flew the mission. Then you had a backup crew and a support crew as well. So a mission of 3 astronauts really involved 9 astronauts. And then, of course, the others would still be around the space centers helping out with various duties. As for Jim Lovell during the moon landing for Apollo 11, he was in mission control. You see him on the left here. He's second from the left in that left-hand image. He was the backup commander for Apollo 11. So although he hadn't trained as much as Neil Armstrong, he'd done all the same training as Neil Armstrong. He was very familiar with everything Armstrong was supposed to be doing. So Lovell was a great resource to have there in mission control. So that's exactly where he was. Similarly with Ken Mattingly, definitely disappointed to not be flying on Apollo 13. Well, at least originally. But he was still doing his job. When they launched, he was right there in mission control as well. I think that was the only curveball I put in here. So let's take a look at another one. This one I'll just tell you. We also see in Apollo 13, they're rolling the Saturn V rocket from the giant vehicle assembly building. Truly an impressive structure. You should definitely go see it if you ever have a chance to at Kennedy Space Center. But in the movie, it's depicted rolling to the launch pad just 2 days before launch. Not quite accurate. You do have to assemble the whole rocket in the vehicle assembly building. You do have to roll it all the way out to the launch pad. But even after you got to the launch pad, there was still a lot of work to do. So that rocket rolled out to the launch pad well in advance, months in advance. And in the case of Apollo 13, the Saturn V rocket made the trip in mid-December of 1969. So it was out there for about 4 months. Now, all kinds of things happened during those 4 months. One thing that I always like telling people when we get into the stories of Apollo is actually about Apollo 11. But while the rocket was waiting on the launch pad, all kind of final preparations were taking place. Of course, the astronauts were finishing up their training. Other folks at NASA were starting to plan for how the astronauts would mark this occasion of landing on the moon. And they came up with a few things. There's, of course, a plaque on the leg of the lunar module. Here's a view of it actually inside the Saturn V rocket. So if you can see my cursor, it's right in the middle of this image. There's a plaque there. In this image, it's covered with a piece of aluminum, of silver metal there. To protect it during its journey to the moon. That's the plaque that they famously read during the Apollo 11 moonwalk, said that they came in peace for all mankind. But during Apollo 11 and really prior to that point in the Apollo program, NASA hadn't really planned for anything like planting an American flag on the moon. And it was kind of tied to that idea of them going in peace for all mankind. You don't necessarily want to put your nation's flag on the surface of the moon if the whole thing is supposed to be one big goodwill gesture as it goes down in history. But NASA decided kind of last minute, they did want a flag on the moon. So some engineers at Johnson Space Center were tasked with designing an apparatus to contain a flag during its space flight, carry it to the moon. A couple of guys actually had to climb inside the Saturn V rocket on the launch pad the night before Apollo 11 launched, bolt this holder to the leg of the lunar module. You see one of them posing with it there. And that would be deployed on the moon just 3 days later by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. So I think that's a pretty cool thing. If you can really look carefully in this image, there's also an uncovered copy of the plaque in the very center of that latest image. Now, Apollo 13 had that same flag. They installed it a little bit earlier because they knew they were going to take it. They had a similar plaque on the leg of the lunar module. For those middle Apollo Apollo missions. There were no special sayings printed on the plaque. It just had the autographs of all the astronauts. But because Ken Mattingly was replaced on the mission so late, they didn't have time to print up a new plaque. So the plaque that was actually on the leg of the real Aquarius lunar module had Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Ken Mattingly's name on it. They did make one with Jack Swigert's name. They just didn't get it installed in time. So it was aboard the spacecraft. A copy of it makes a cameo appearance in the movie too, as they're moving material from the lunar module to the command module, trying to get the mass right. You actually see that plaque float by. So the original plan was, if they had landed on the moon, Lovell would take that plaque with him when he went down for the EVA. They'd replace the plaque on the lunar module on the moon. So it would have been a kind of a unique moment in the space program as well. But as it stands, that replacement plaque made it back to Earth. It's on display at the Adler Planetarium today. More on the topic of the rocket, it's time on the launch pad, how it looked there. This is really splitting hairs, but the paint scheme is wrong on the rocket in the movie. The movie's rocket is on the left. The real Apollo 13 Saturn V is on the right. At the very bottom, those black stripes are too tall in the movie. There's another stripe missing, but that's not really that important. All right, back to our little guessing game. Let's see. All right, so a couple more scenes from the movie. In this case, one of these, I promise you, is a real event that happened in connection with the Apollo 13 movie and the people involved. The other, a work of fiction. On the left, I've got a scene from just before the launch, the night before the launch. The crew is off on the left-hand side of the road in this screenshot, and their families and some close friends off on the right-hand side of the road. We probably recognize that today. They're practicing a little social distancing to make sure that the astronauts stay healthy on their journey. Makes perfect sense. Then over on the right, we've got a scene depicting Marilyn Lovell. She's dropped her wedding ring down the drain just prior to the Apollo 13 launch. Very dramatic moment, perhaps a harbinger of things to come. All right, so one of these actually happened. One of these was invented for the movie. I'll give you just a moment. And again, the social distancing makes a lot of sense. You would think NASA might do that. But in fact, that's the one that was invented for the movie. The Apollo 13 astronauts weren't subject to a whole lot of special medical requirements or quarantine prior to their launch. After all, that's how Ken Mattingly got exposed to the measles and got pulled off the mission. It was one of the children of, I think, Charlie Duke, one of the backup crew members. They got the measles, exposed Ken Mattingly. He hadn't had it yet. So NASA was worried that he would get sick on the way to the moon. So they pulled him off the mission. And they kind of learned their lesson after Apollo 13. So subsequent crews would have to be a little more careful prior to their launch. And today, if you pay attention to astronauts getting ready to launch into space, they'll go into quarantine about 2 weeks before their scheduled launch, even just for flights up to the International Space Station that astronauts are doing today. NASA being much more mindful of astronauts' health and keeping them safe even prior to launch. So that kind of quarantine moment during Apollo 13 didn't actually happen. All right, another one. On the left here, we've got a scene from, that is a nightmare that Marilyn Lovell is having, depicting an accident on Jim Lovell's flight, and he actually gets ejected from the spacecraft, which would be pretty bad news, pretty dramatic. Again, maybe a harbinger of things to come. And then on the right, it's probably kind of tough to tell exactly what moment that is in the movie, but that is pulled from the portion during their return journey. The spacecraft's gotten very cold, tensions are running very high. The astronauts are under a huge amount of stress, and they kind of start bickering a little bit, fighting a little bit in the spacecraft. Certainly a dramatic moment in the movie as well. So what do we think? The dramatic nightmare or the dramatic fight? Which one is fictionalized? It's the fight between the astronauts. Well, they certainly were under a lot of stress. Their safe return was not guaranteed. These were also very professional flyers. They weren't going to fight among one another during the mission. If they distract any member of the crew with infighting, there's a higher chance that none of them make it home safely. So the astronauts all say that all of their interactions during the mission are very professional. In the movie, Jack Swigert kind of gets blamed for causing the accident, but there was really no blame to be had. It was a result of a technical fault that happened well before the flight. Jack Swigert just happened to be the one that received the call to flip that switch that resulted in the explosion. Any of the astronauts could have been the one to flip the switch. None of them would have been directly responsible. Marilyn Lovell did have a nightmare like that, though. Jim Lovell had taken her on a date not too long before the Apollo 13 mission, watched a movie called Marooned, which did feature a space flight where there was an accident and an astronaut like Jim, named Jim, got stranded. So there were seeds planted in her mind for that nightmare, and that really did happen. All right. A couple really big moments in the movie, famous taglines that you probably associate with Apollo 13, the movie, and the real mission. We've got that moment shortly after the explosion when Tom Hanks, as Jim Lovell, says, "Houston, we have a problem." Oh, who could forget those lines? Then back on Earth, as the folks in Mission Control are trying to determine how they'll get the astronauts back home safely, we've got the flight director, the guy in charge of everybody in Mission Control, saying that failure is not an option. Also, iconic words. But one of these lines is fiction. Now, you probably realize they couldn't totally make up the line that the astronauts said on in the capsule. They actually used a lot of the real flight transcripts to write the lines that the astronauts said in the movie. So a lot of onboard dialogue, incredibly accurate. So the fiction here is that line, "Failure is not an option." That one was written for the movie. It was not used by the real Gene Kranz during the Apollo 13 mission. But the real Gene Kranz was pretty fond of the line. So when he wrote his own autobiography a couple years later, he would use that as the title. So that phrase is now pretty closely associated with the real man as well. And NASA has really latched onto it as well. You head to any NASA gift shop at any of their centers, you can get sweatshirts, t-shirts, socks, whatever. And they say failure is not an option as well. So something from the movie that has really integrated real NASA culture. That's not to say they totally get off the hook for what Tom Hanks said in the movie. There's a chance that maybe that line is not perfectly accurate. Tom Hanks says, "Houston, we have a problem," but I could imagine a couple of other ways that an astronaut may have expressed that same sentiment. Slight differences in the writing here, but one of the lines, as I've written it on the screen here, is what the astronauts said during the real Apollo 13 mission. So we've got, "Houston, we have a problem." "Houston, we've got a problem." And "Houston, we've had a problem." Slight changes in language here. And it turns out that during the real Apollo 13 mission, it's actually that last one. Jack Swigert made the call first, but he used those words, "Houston, we've had a problem." Jim Lovell repeated that exact same phrase back. "Houston, we have a problem." They chose that in the movie to give it a little more sense of urgency. We've had a problem. That's past tense. Like, they're over it now. Everything's going to be okay. But by saying "we have a problem" in the movie, that gives them a problem that's still going on, something to solve. That gives them the challenge in the movie, helps subtly drive the narrative just a little bit. I believe in Apollo 13, the movie, Kevin Bacon actually says, "We've got a problem." But that line was also used as the title of that failed 1974 made-for-TV movie. So all of these lines kind of have ties to Hollywood's portrayal of the mission as well. Okay, so they didn't get everything perfectly right during the movie, but that's okay. There were a lot of things they did really, really well. As I said, by and large, the things that the astronauts say during the mission, based on the actual transcripts. NASA recorded all of the radio transmissions between the astronauts and mission control. There are also onboard recorders that could record additional communication between the astronauts, even when they weren't transmitting to mission control. Those were recovered after the mission. So that part of the mission, or that part of the movie, incredibly accurate. Also, just the general look of the inside of the spacecraft, and even the microgravity, which is the really impressive thing. Microgravity, the apparent weightlessness in space, is something that's incredibly difficult to replicate for movies. One of the best ways to get microgravity is to go into space, and that's kind of tough to pull off for a whole film crew. So that's pretty rare. It has happened for a Russian movie, actually, just recently. A Russian actress and a cameraman were up on the International Space Station filming a movie. So for Apollo 13, what they did instead was take advantage of one of NASA's aircraft. At the time, it was a KC-135. They're flying a newer model of aircraft now. And now there's some commercial ventures that do the similar kind of thing. But you get in this big cargo aircraft, and the pilot does these steep parabolic curves. You'll do a steep climb, you go up over the top of the curve, you'll dive back down. And it's kind of like going up over the top of a hill on a roller coaster. As you go over the top of the hill, on a roller coaster, your stomach kind of lifts up for a little bit. But if you keep diving, you stay in free fall, you experience a brief period of microgravity, a brief period of free fall, just like astronauts do in space. So that's how a lot of the onboard footage for Apollo 13 was filmed. The sets were loaded up into the KC-135, affectionately nicknamed the Vomit Comet, and they set up the cameras, and for 20, 30 seconds at a time, they would get microgravity. They would film a short clip, and they'd wait for the next parabola, and they'd do another take if needed. And they just pieced the onboard scenes together bit by bit in that way. And that was mostly used for shots like what I'm showing you here on the left, where we've got, that would be our astronaut Fred Hayes doing a flip in the lunar module. If you can see the whole actor's body, they need to obviously be floating. They would definitely film that in the aircraft. They did a few others on land, on a soundstage, using the time-tested technique of just having the actor wobble a little bit, right? And if you're just focusing on their face, you might be able to convince viewers that those folks are floating as well. I actually watched some of the DVD extras getting ready for tonight, and some of the actors said that they can't even remember anymore which scenes were filmed where. Overall, the look is convincing enough in all of the scenes that are supposed to be in space that they don't remember when they were really floating and when they weren't. But that was a huge undertaking, something that no space movie had ever attempted before. Another great length they went to make the movie accurate was just make sure that they were referencing as many real artifacts and real documents as they could. So when you see the spacesuits, the cameras that the astronauts are using in space, all the little props scattered around in the spacecraft and in places like Mission Control on Earth, the film crew went to amazing length and paid great attention to detail to make sure those were accurate. I should just brag on a former employer here for a little bit. I used to work at a place called the Kansas Cosmosphere. It's in the middle of Kansas, a city called Hutchinson. That's actually the home of the real Apollo 13 command module. So out of the whole mission, you have that big Saturn V rocket that launches. Most of that gets discarded, as you see during the launch sequence, just to get the spacecraft into space. We got the command and service module and the lunar module. We see them use the lunar module as a lifeboat during the movie. That's how it was during the real mission as well, but that gets discarded before they come home. Just that little gumdrop shaped command module ever makes it home. There are various Apollo command modules are in various museums around the country and the world. And Apollo 13 Odyssey ended up at the Cosmosphere. It's on loan from the Smithsonian, and it's at the Cosmosphere because a team there, a subsidiary named SpaceWorks, dedicated themselves in the 90s to restoring the capsule as closely as they could to its condition as it would have been when the mission splashed down. Over the years, various components had been removed from the capsule. The couches that the astronauts sat in, those had been removed. Some parts of the control panel, other internals had been disassembled for testing, and then some were on display, some were in private collections. So the museum went to great lengths to reassemble all these original components, reassemble the command module Odyssey as it would have originally been. So that's on display there. The SpaceWorks team also worked with the Apollo 13 filmmakers, and they helped make the sets and costumes and props for the movie. So those spacesuits that the actors are wearing in the movie, fully functioning spacesuits, at least functioning enough for the astronauts to be comfortable during the time they had to wear them. Maybe I wouldn't wear them on a real space mission, but they were very accurate replicas of what the real Apollo astronauts wore. Same for the sets and the control panels and everything, all based on what really existed inside the real Apollo spacecraft. So that all incredibly accurate as well. This new image, just the actual dials in the real command module. Those are the pressure gauges for those cryogenic oxygen tanks that played such a central role in the movie. More recently, the team at SpaceWorks has worked with NASA to do things like restore the Apollo era mission control. For filming Apollo 13, they built their own set. They built their own mission control, but again, incredible attention to detail. And you had folks like Jerry Bostick that were working on the movie, and they were pretty convinced that on the set, they were in the real mission control. It was that accurate that you were convincing guys that spent probably way too many hours of their life in that real room. Work-life balance wasn't really a thing for anybody involved with Apollo. But the real mission control room, it had kind of been preserved. Some of the hardware was there, but all of the paperwork, all of the just the personal effects of the people that worked in the room, all of that was long gone. But over the last couple of years, the Johnson Space Center, along with their visitors center, Space Center Houston, undertook a project to fully restore that historic mission control center to make it look exactly as it would have during the Apollo days. So that is now open to visitors, but other folks at SpaceWorks and the Cosmosphere pretty involved in that as well. So that's another reason the Apollo 13 movie really looks as good as it does. They had the right people involved, and they were paying incredible attention to detail, and they went to pretty great lengths, like flying on the KC-135 to replicate microgravity. And so all told, we get a movie that is incredibly accurate, a great depiction of what those astronauts faced during their harrowing journey to the moon, and gives you a little insight into what those days were really like for the astronauts and everyone working at NASA. With our splashdown here on the screen, that's the real splashdown of Apollo 13. That was the end of their real mission, and that's also the end of my prepared talks. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in, and be happy to address those as well.
Wow, that was awesome. I feel like I learned so much, and yeah, you guys are welcome to send questions you have in the chat box or in the Q&A. I did have a couple of folks send me some questions beforehand, so if you don't mind, I'll throw some of those at you.
Sure.
The first one that I have is kind of a simple question, but I truly do not know the answer. How do astronauts keep their space suit, like their helmets, from fogging up? Like in the movie, you see them put the helmet over their head and it doesn't fog up. And now that we've all lived in a COVID era, I think we know what happens like when you have a mask and glasses. So do
Yeah.
you have any idea?
Um, this answer is going to be based on newer spacesuits, but I have to assume that it would have been similar during Apollo. I know that the newer spacesuits, just the way that air moves inside the suit is specifically designed to keep cool air moving along that inner part
Oh,
of the visor. So that helps keep it clear.
oh, very cool. Okay. So I'm glad you pointed this out when you were doing the program. You talked about how the shuttle was actually put out 4 months in advance.
Mhm.
So do they have anything put in place to make sure that it's protected in that 4 month period from any sort of like natural disaster, or is they just sort of leaning into luck?
Uh, no, yeah, there was another. Yeah, don't know where I could quickly find a picture of it, but yeah, there was another section of gantry that would also roll out to join it. So when the rocket rolls out, it was as depicted way back here. Yeah, there we go. So just rolling out to the launch pad, it did look like this. You just had this one flat gray section, the red tower and the rocket on top. But when it was parked out at the launch pad for those 3 or 4 months, there's another big red gantry that would drive along that same track, kind of up on the other side of the rocket. So side that's bare in these images, and that would offer a little more protection. It also fully surrounded the very top of the rocket, so gave workers
Ah,
access to all parts of the spacecraft. I Yeah, if it didn't protect the whole rocket, so I'm not sure if there had been a hurricane or something like that. Also a Florida concern. I don't think they ever had to roll a Saturn V back, but certainly something that we've seen with space shuttles and things
oh,
like that. So it would have been a possibility.
yeah, it just feels like they had to have so much luck on their side. Like, certainly the technology is there, but if you compare the technology that they have to what we've got now, I'm just awed that anybody made it to the moon, to be
Yeah,
honest with you.
yeah.
Okay, and then the other thing that I just wanted to mention, I know that you talked about the fact that the transcripts, the script, and a lot of the onboard dialogue is like lifted straight from those transcripts.
Yeah.
One of the things that I didn't realize was available is NASA actually published those transcripts. So if anybody's curious and you want to read an obscene number of pages with abbreviations that you don't understand, it is available, and I did do that. And one thing that's pretty cool is at the beginning they tell you what all of the abbreviations mean. So I
Yeah.
went on a Google just wormhole, Googling everything about all of the stuff they were talking about. So if anybody else is interested, just know that you can Google it and it's pretty easy to find.
Yeah. I mean, imagine how much longer the transcripts would be if they spelled it out every time.
Oh yeah, truly, truly. But I did feel like I was learning a new language, just
Oh
trying
yeah.
to try and follow along. So it looks like we have a question in the Q&A box. It says, was there anything that Jim Lovell wanted in the movie that didn't make it in, and vice versa? Like, did he want anything taken out?
Not that I'm aware of, because he literally wrote the book. This the story is kind of told the way that he wanted it to be told. About the only other mistake that I'm aware of that I've seen in interviews is they give him the wrong color of Corvette in that very first scene too. I think it's blue or I think it's red in the movie. He had a
Yeah, it's
blue
red.
one or something
Yeah.
like that. So
Wow, what a problem to have.
yeah.
What a problem to have. Okay, so I see another question. Was it Mattingly who actually solved the power issue?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was planning to mention that. So thanks for that question. Yeah, Ken Mattingly is depicted in the movie as kind of the one astronaut that comes into work late and solves all those problems. In reality, just like all those astronauts were always in mission control and or the backup crews, the support crews. The Ken Mattingly we see in the movie is probably best described as a composite of a team of maybe 4 or 5 different astronauts that all contributed to that effort. He was certainly there, certainly one of them, and probably just a little bit easier for the movie to turn into one person.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things that we see a lot, especially when we're looking at sort of historical films. So many composite characters
Yeah.
with a lot of players at once. I'm just not able to wrap my brain around the idea that they actually filmed inside that plane. Like
Yeah.
that is, can you imagine how much money that cost and how much time that took?
Oh,
Like,
can't imagine the money. I mean, I know it took a lot of time, but
yeah, yeah, like that's incredible. And now they may not have to do that, but it's cool that they were able to.
yeah.
Well, let's see. I see a comment. If the rocket can't handle our weather, you'll never find someone willing to go into space conditions in it. Yeah, I certainly think that's true. Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah,
Florida, man, you never know
yeah,
what's
for the
going on
most
there.
part, the rockets are pretty hardy. They're designed to be in Florida, so they can withstand all but the worst storms.
Yes, yes. Um, let's see. I think that is all of the questions that I had in advance from folks. So thank you guys
Okay.
for sending those in. And if anybody has any other final questions before we wrap up for the evening, Justin, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, I think we have one
Yeah,
more
we
in the
did get one
Q&A.
more.
Oh, about this Russian movie crew. I think we have a question about that.
Yeah. So in general, over the course of history, Russia has been a little more open with sending tourists and things like that into space. There'd been a little break, but they've done it fairly regularly with the International Space Station, and just last year or the year before, they sent I think it was just one actress, one cameraman to the International Space Station for a couple of weeks. And they filmed scenes for, see, it's a movie called Challenge. I don't know that much about it, Russian language, of course. And I don't think it has been released anywhere outside of Russia. So I don't think it's available for anyone to watch. I don't know where these plans stand, but over the last couple of years, I've also heard about rumblings that Tom Cruise might be planning a space movie that would involve an actual space flight as well.
Well, all right. We'll see how that goes. Wow, that gives us something to think about then. Maybe we can movie myth bust whatever Tom Cruise ends up making in space.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I think that sort of wraps us up for the evening, guys. Thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you at both of our museums for our upcoming space exhibitions at the VMHC. We'll see you for Apollo. And Justin, do you want to tell us about the exhibition you guys are hosting?
Yeah, of course. It's called Space, an Out of Gravity Experience. That's opening at the end of May, I believe, May 27th. That's kind of a more general look at the challenges we have to face to send humans into space.
Oh, well, perfect. So you guys can have a summer of space with us because both of the exhibitions will be up through the summer. So again, thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, guys.